Jennifer. I'm also with my collaborator, co-author Angela Ziebell.
Great.
And yeah.
Welcome, Angela.
Who will be sharing the screen. Okay, so I'm pretty sure maybe everybody knows me, who I am, but for those of who don't know who I am, I'm Eun-ji. I'm a School of Education and Professional Study, and I'm here with my co-author of the chapter and collaborator, Dr. Angela Ziebell at Deakin University. So our chapter is entitled Decolonial Science Teaching and Learning in Practice. And our editor, they actually ask us to write specifically for the teachers, professional audience like teachers. So in writing this chapters, we wanted to telling a story. So we adopted a script-based approach where our ideas are more easily accessible and illustrated for teacher audiences. Before we begin, we would also like to acknowledge our country where we are. I would like to acknowledge Yagra and Turrbal people, where I currently live and currently am located. And Angela?
And I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation.
Yes, and then as a non-Indigenous educator and researchers, acknowledging the country and understanding our positionality in relation to local place and people are important. So for myself, I was born in Korea. That's a picture of myself and my grandmother. So also I lived in Canada and Australia. So doesn't matter where I am, having the sense of belonging grounded in where my grandmother is sort of helping me to understand my positionality in such settler colonial states such as Canada and Australia. So my professional experiences, where my first degree was biology. So where the institution where I studied biology about 20 years ago, unfortunately, they already had Indigenous Science incorporated in the Faculty of Biological Sciences. So I had an opportunity to learn directly from the community members and elders alongside with conventional science, which we term here as Western modern science to follow the term that's represented in the field of science and science education. And after biology, I became science teacher. I wanted to replicate the type of teaching and learning that I have learned from community members and elders from the Faculty of Science. But when I was science teacher, there was virtually no resources and I didn't know how to go about doing it. So I studied, master and PhD to understand the status and various approaches in the field of science. After PhD, I worked as an education consultant for various First Nations school board in Canada, where I developed land-based curriculum as well as provide workshop for community teachers and then non-Indigenous teachers who are working in the community. And then I moved to Australia, and then it was my first time coming to Australia, so I needed to really understand people's experiences to prepare myself how to go about doing the work with community. So at Griffith, as you can see, Tasha Riley and Troy Meston has been guiding me a lot, but I also needed to think about how to approach my work in the field of science. So I approached Angela, who was actually leading community practice at the Australian College of Deans of Science.
So I'm also non-Indigenous. I'm a chemist by training with a PhD in chemistry as well and no official qualifications in education. I'm going to go through sort of my journey in terms of almost topics. So firstly, when I was younger, Indigenous science was something I was exposed to as a child with a father who had an interest but was also a biology teacher. So I was growing up in an environment where this was, valid information, and it was put forward that way as being very valuable. Professional interest then developed later when I was first studying my undergraduate, and then as a curriculum developer, I had a 3-year program where I had the luxury of being able to find a place to put something that I thought was very valuable to that curriculum. And of course, that had lots of different instances, but there were places that I could put Indigenous science learning in the end. So that came about through learning from colleagues. I was working at Monash at the same time as Tyson Younger Porter, and he was sort of the first one I talked to about how we could go about familiarising students, preparing students to learn this information, and what a good lesson looked like, of course. Then that moves on to learning from more specialised niche resources, which I generally found starting, 6 or 7 years ago, that I had to go out and spend days looking at what video was out there, what document from some local group was out there. And those resources are becoming more and more easy to find, and there are places that are collating them to some extent too. And that took me through to actually making the resources myself, understanding that students don't have a science-based resource that they can learn from, and a neutral cultural competency resource that's not based in science is actually not very engaging to them. So over time, we've seen a growing recognition, I guess that parallels my journey a little bit, of Indigenous knowledges and how they can address global challenges. There are some general resources here that are listed, or some really important moments in time, really. So UNESCO recognition, we have ACARA and embedding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures here, and that's the cross-cultural priority, cross-curricular priority. And only 2 weeks ago, we had Indigenous knowledges feature really, really highly in the brand new National Science and Research Priorities. Now, they only come out once a decade, so that's a big change too.
With this recognition, so we also need to be mindful that Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous science have been historically faced marginalization and misrepresentation. And part of it is because, especially in the field of science education, there's no epistemological theoretical consensus regarding the meaning and representation of Western modern science in Indigenous science, or in their interrelationship. So before you start your practices, you need to center Indigenous through a relationship-based approach and understanding of the relationship between Indigenous knowledge as well as this conventional science as well.
So before we get started, we want to take a moment to think about what science would mean to you or to the science educator in question. We want to think about how do Indigenous ways of coming to know different things, coming to knowledge, differ. And we're going to go through a continuum of those at the moment, starting first with almost the two extremes. So this is the universalist versus the multiculturalist. And the universalist science approach is that science is just culture-free. There's this canon of knowledge that is not influenced by culture. Going not quite to the extreme, but towards the other end, that science is recognised as being embedded in the context of that cultural group. Obviously, that varies with cultural group, and therefore that's laden with systems and those cultural systems. So they view science as being rational, but it's also culturally based. It's still empirically sound way of knowing, but it has a cultural influence.
Yes, but then if you look at the contemporary literature of science education, even in this universalist and multiculturalist, their conceptualization of the relationship between Indigenous knowledge and Western modern science is not so like this clear-cut binary. Even universalist has different views among themselves, so as multiculturalists. And also now we need to consider the postcolonialist literature on how they see the relationship between Indigenous and Western modern science as well. So to just briefly go over these diverse positions. So universalist, the first position, they do not recognize Indigenous knowledge as science. The only kind of science they recognize is the Western modern science that's developed from the Enlightenment era. However, the other position within universalists, they do see that, hey, Indigenous knowledge can be considered as scientific, but they do have their own criteria as what's considered as good science. And often those good science criteria is objective, that is still following the West modern tradition. So indigenous knowledge is considered as inferior comparison to Western modern science.
So the critique to the universalist approach is that the good science criteria, as Amy just alluded to, comes from a European Enlightenment model. And this is based on a white male colonial supremacy sort of approach to knowledge. Now, while a lot of people are uncomfortable with that sort of language, that simply means that those ideas were established when in a European dominant time, with the Western thinking, what's the word, Amy? The Western, the thinking being the main influence of all of those processes. And the Western way of doing things in this case is seen as both morally more superior and intellectually superior over any non-Western aspects. So we have to step back, though, and accept that science isn't neutral. Science has evolved with people working together. For instance, if we take a laboratory environment, that's a group of people working together, influenced by individuals and their approaches, what they decide is valuable to work on, how they decide to work on it, and what they see as a valid answer, all influences the work that's done.
Moving towards the multiculturalist, there are largely three different positions. First is parallel approaches. They see Western modern science and indigenous knowledge as complementary, but their starting point is West modern-based science curriculum. Second approach is crossing. Their approach is mainly for indigenous students to learn better in science classrooms, school science classrooms. So the border crossing idea is embedded in here. Third idea is emerging hybrid. So the metaphor that's used to describe this approach is gamma. It's a longer term where fresh water meets salt water, lots of diversity flourishes. A lot of Canadian scholars has talked about it. For example, Hachel talked about it as two-eyed seeing as well. So the postcolonialists, though, at the far end of that continuum that we saw earlier, would argue that multiculturalists still don't consider issues related to power and hegemony as that are really important to include. The post-colonialists on the far end of the continuum aim to disrupt and resist any sort of imperialism or colonialism and dislocate that Eurocentric dominant ideas from Western culture, identity, science and education. So they're also against notions of boundary in education, as they are seen as products of Western imperialism. So of course they're advocates for interdisciplinary learning, transdisciplinary learning, and as part of that, Indigenous knowledges are central to their teaching. The critique here, though, is that this post-colonialist approach, is probably too theoretical. It's also probably too ambiguous in a school science setting. And of course, that also makes it too ambitious for most teachers. Moving on from that continuity, we wanted to raise just the idea that this topic is dominated by complexities. Some of these are absolutely inherent in the topic. Some of them are evolving conversations, which terms are used, how they're used, and some of those will always differ because different disciplines have a history of using language in different ways. Some of them are moving forward, though. So we're all interested for people to keep an eye on things like, are people using terms like Indigenous knowledges or Indigenous science? What are they referring to? Are people preferring words like Indigenous or First Nations or Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander? Now, you may have noticed throughout this work that we have some artwork. That is not my talent for sure. I have no artistic talent. I don't know about Amy.
All of these resources, the artwork, are done by the Deacon Design Group, and they have been working with myself and the Australian Council of Environmental Deans and Directors to develop a small resource that is called EnviroCare. There's the logo there. And we just really briefly wanted to recognise their beautiful artwork because we have used it on the talk, and take this opportunity just to quickly explain. This is kind of the next step. We can talk about different approaches to thinking, but what do we put in front of our students? So in the higher education space, this is a new resource with these 4 modules, and people have the choice of doing whichever one they want. The students can absolutely do them even if they're not prescribed by an educator. For example, module 2 has some of these topics in it. Obviously, that's not the whole list. It's a bit cut off. And so students will be able to work their way through these modules. They are assessed. They do get a certificate at the end, which they can hand in if needed. And we just felt this was a really important resource to be able to offer those that didn't have anything else to offer to their students at the moment. And it's part of that ongoing conversation about developing educators too, because the educators have to be able to pass these modules in order to offer them to their students. So with that, I will thank you and see if we have time for question, or we're moving on to open questions. And thank you, Amy, for the invitation to be part of writing this chapter.
And thank you for the editors for the invitations as well. Thank you.